America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Jamey Bowers, a producer with the Job Creators Network Foundation.
And I'm Toni Angelini, Senior Vice President of Advocacy and Operations.
I ask all our listeners and viewers to subscribe to the show at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Today, we're joined by Erika Donalds. Erika is the founder and CEO of Optima Ed, the Optima Foundation. She's a former elected member of the Collier County School Board and now serves as a visiting fellow for the Heritage Foundation Center for Education Policy. Erika is married to Byron Donalds, the Republican congressman from Florida, and is the mother of 3 sons. Welcome, Erika.
Thanks so much for having me. Excited to be with you.
Yeah, this is kind of interesting. Education has not really been a focus of the election so far. There's been a lot of talk about the economy. But what do you think a Harris-Walz presidency would mean to education in America?
Well, there's a reason why they haven't talked about it very much, and that's because the Democrats' record on education is so abysmal, and they really don't have anything to stand on. You know, the decisions that they've made, certainly over the past several years, the Biden-Harris administration, have done nothing to improve academic proficiency in this country, which we know is really in the tank. I mean, there's no other way to say it. From a national perspective, you know, less than half of our students are on grade level at proficiency for reading and math. You know, we are not competing with the rest of the world when it comes to our academics. And there's absolutely no solutions coming from the side of the Democrats. When you look at Governor Walz, he has presided over a 10-point drop in reading and math proficiency in his state, now under 50% for both of those measurements. So really, what are they going to say? They not only have a horrible record, but they have no solutions.
Yeah. I wonder, would some of that, would the excuse be, hey, COVID was there, you know, we're judging Walz on a 4-year period where, you know, clearly education was under siege by COVID and now I would argue that their adherence to the teachers' unions' demands and keeping schools closed would mean that they bear some of that responsibility. But I'm guessing that across the country, scores have gone down.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Unfortunately, though, what they tout when it comes to their education record is that they've increased funding to education. He specifically has said he increased funding to education. However, when you look at how those dollars have been spent, they have not been spent on improving academic efficiency. They've been spent on social programs, and increased food, you know, offerings at school and other things that have nothing to do with helping students to read and do mathematics at proficiency. So again, yeah, they say the right things, and maybe they have a point that some of that drop is from COVID. However, that drop has been taking place, as you know, across the country and especially in Democrat-run areas well before COVID. And these areas have been slower to come back than those areas like Florida that have not only gone back earlier, have better accountability, have less influence of unions, and are spending money on the right things.
So speaking of COVID, Erika, I'm sitting in very blue New Jersey, and I am in an area where there are some parochial schools, you know, surrounding our public schools. My daughter, who's now in college, she left 8th grade in March of 2020 and did not go back to a full day of regular school until first day of sophomore year of high school. But you had the kids around here who were going to private school who, after the initial 2 weeks to slow the spread, the private schools started opening. And those kids didn't skip a beat academically. So she was competing while going into college. She was competing against applicants who had had a full education throughout COVID. And you look at the amount, the dollars that we spend per student in this area. Every kid in my town could be put through private school with the funding that the state provides. But the public school kids here, just like in Tim Walz's Minnesota, their scores continue to go down. And I guess my question for you is, why is it that the media continues to allow people like Governor Walz to stand on the soapbox that they prioritize education just because they're funneling money into the system, and they are never held accountable for the fact that the education of this generation was the first sacrifice that they were more than willing to make so that they could really clamp down on all of us during COVID?
And you're absolutely right. And it's unfortunate that students like yours are competing with people from around the country, and especially students from around the country that were able to go back earlier, whether they're in your neighborhood or across the country. I mean, when we talk about comparing like Minnesota to other states, prior to COVID, Minnesota was ranked 5th. Their schools were ranked 5th in the country. And in 2024, they were ranked 17th. So the entire country went through COVID. The entire country, yes, has taken a hit academically from those years. But when you look at their ranking compared to the other states, you can see that they have severely fell behind. And you're seeing that in states like New Jersey and others that lost 2 years of learning. Those students are never getting that back. This is a generational impact for students in those areas that did not get to go back to school for 2 years that we haven't even seen the first part of. I mean, this is the tip of the iceberg when you're talking about students who are already in 8th grade. What about the students who did not learn to read in their prime learning to read years from kindergarten to 2nd grade? That and just gives me chills to even talk about it, because those students will never catch up, and they're still in elementary school, right? What happens when those students are having to compete to go to college and to get the jobs of tomorrow? So we really have a crisis in America. We need people who are going to be very serious and honest about where we are in every state, and not throw money at the problem like Tim Walz has done to give teachers more paid time off, when what they need is to pay teachers to teach more days to get these students even partially caught up from all that they missed.
Yeah, what are some of the things that in the states that have been recovering well, what have they been doing that has actually raised those scores on the basic things that kids need to know? I mean, the reading scores, the math scores, which seem to have become passé in modern education discussions. The discussions are all about social justice. They're all about things that don't go back to the basics of science, math, reading, which are really the foundations to learn anything.
Well, it all comes down to additional learning time, and the states and the districts that are using the additional COVID funds or have used them on tutoring and small group instruction and other enrichment are the ones who are really investing in the children and not in things that are not going to really get those students ahead academically. And that's what we would be looking for all of these schools and districts, to spend the additional funds on additional learning time. Unfortunately, we did not see that in many states, and especially blue states across the country. I vividly remember LA Unified School District in their negotiations after COVID and how these additional funds were going to be spent. A survey or a study had just come out that students in that area who had missed as much school as those students did needed at least 4 months of additional learning. So there isn't even an additional 4 months available in the school year, right? In the year at all, in the calendar year. So they needed 4 more months of learning. The district wanted the teachers to work an additional 10 days, optional 10 days, but they wanted to add 10 days to the calendar and give both students and teachers the option to learn for an additional 10 days. And the teachers union would not even agree to 10 additional days of learning for the students who had missed 2 years. How are those students ever going to catch up? So we it's very obvious that, and we've known this for many, many years, that teachers' unions are not there to help students succeed. They are there to represent adults and the interests of the unions themselves. And so until we can get them out of the way and do what's best for kids, as we've been able to do in states like Florida, especially areas where it's a very strong school choice environment where teachers do not have to be unionized and they can make decisions that are best for kids, those areas like New Jersey, like California, are going to really struggle academically, and they're going to continue to fall further and further behind.
The one silver lining that I would say from the COVID education period was that I think a lot of parents out there realized what you just said, that the teachers' unions are clearly in it to represent adults and their interests and not the interests of the kids that are being taught. And so, but at the same time, I think their power has not diminished. And while I think people kind of got a glimpse behind the curtain, it didn't really manifest itself in any real actions. For those people who are listening or watching who don't know what the teachers' unions do in terms of seniority or tenure, can you explain some of those things and how they really hurt our education system right now?
Well, yes. And I can give you some personal experiences having been on the school board here in Florida. Even in a place where the unions don't seem to be as strong, they still can put a wrench in making decisions that put students first. But in general, teachers' unions can require through the negotiations and the union contracts that someone who has been there longer can have better positions, can stay. So if a school district has to cut teachers, as many of them have had to do or should have done because they don't have as many students, they can take a teacher who has been there longer and keep that person, even if they underperform a teacher who is new, who is an outstanding teacher, whose students are learning better, who is doing a better job. But because of this policy, the veteran teacher gets to keep the position over a new teacher. That's one example. Let me give you a personal example from when I served on the Collier County School Board. We have an area of town called Immokalee. It's very transient, very low income. A lot of students who are new immigrants who do not speak the language, parents who are working, who do not have the time to help their students. It's a very poor area and very low performing, obviously, academically as a result of many of those factors. And historically, what I found in requesting information from the school district, that 20% of the teachers in that area, in those schools, were new teachers, 20% of them. That number for the rest of our county was only 6%. So what was clear is that, just like happens in many areas, the veteran teachers were selecting the easier positions. This is another issue because they pay the same. Why is a teacher going to go all the way out to Immokalee, which is kind of remote, and teach the most difficult students when they're going to get paid the same amount as if they were, in my neighborhood, teaching students with upper middle class parents who are doing a lot of the work at home as well? It pays the same. That's a union issue as well. What I wanted to do, and I proposed this to my colleagues, but I was in the minority, so it was very difficult for me to get these people to agree with me, but they agreed with me on this. Let's provide an escalating bonus to teachers who are willing to teach in Immokalee. The first year it'll be $1,500, the second year $3,000, the third year $5,000. Try to keep them out there for a longer period of time, these veteran high-performing teachers, and attract them out there to teach these very difficult students and give them that financial incentive. We had a pot of money that we had set aside to do this, and we all agreed to do it. So this was a big deal to get the rest of the board to agree with. They didn't agree with me on much. This went to the union bargaining table, of course, because everything has to go through the contract. And what came out of union bargaining is that every single teacher who goes to Immokalee, regardless of their performance, regardless of their status as a veteran teacher or how they've performed, will get a $2,500 stipend for 1 year. So tell me, what did that do to the statistic that 20% of the teachers in Immokalee were brand new and 6% for the rest of the county? Absolutely nothing. What did it do to help the students in Immokalee? Absolutely nothing. What did it do to increase the tenure of teachers out there so that they don't just go out there for a year and come back? Absolutely nothing. And why? Because the teachers union did not want those teachers, high performing teachers, to be rewarded in that way. They wanted to allocate those funds more evenly across the board to everyone, regardless of their performance.
Yeah, it is so maddening, their opposition to any kind of merit pay. Whereas I think most people in their job recognize that if they work harder and have better results, they're going to end up making more money, or at least that's they should go somewhere else where they're going to make more money, or whatever it is. I mean, that is kind of the rule. I mean, even in the restaurant industry, servers that are better servers and friendlier and are more efficient get better tips than the people.
Right.
That's crazy.
Well, we really need to bring a meritocracy into education and give teachers freedom. And I recently wrote an op-ed about this, what I kind of call the Uberification of teaching, which kind of, is hand in hand with the school choice movement, especially education scholarship accounts in places like Florida, or, Arizona, and other states that are following suit, where teachers have that freedom to start their own micro schools, start their own education programs, where if I'm just an excellent algebra teacher, why shouldn't I be able to teach 100 kids at a time? If I can handle that and they're going to perform well, why should the government be able to tell me you can only teach this many kids and you can only teach them at these times and you can only do it in this way and you have to have these certifications to do it or not do it? Let it be on my merit, on my performance, and on the parents deciding, I want my child to be in this person's class, learning from them, whether it's on YouTube or live or in virtual reality like Optima Academy online. But we really need to see teachers have the freedom to teach in ways that have not been in the box in the past, because what we're doing doesn't work anyway. So why hold them back through certifications and bureaucracy? Let the parents and the teachers create an education marketplace that's actually going to perform for our kids, because what we're doing is absolutely not working.
Yeah.
You referenced Optima, and I actually was I wanted to pivot back to it. I remember when COVID hit, you and I had a conversation about what you were doing to make sure that you were able to impact the most students as possible. And I would love for you to kind of tell the story of like where Optima Ed was at, and then how you so quickly pivoted and were able to implement so many virtual strategies and how you really were able to take that to the next level to maximize the impact that you were having at the time.
Well, and this really is hand in hand with what we were just saying, giving education entrepreneurs the freedom and ability to innovate when it's called for, right? So COVID, as you know, I'm very passionate about classical education. After I left the school board, I decided not to run for a second term and instead start a charter management organization to help boards across my state and others to open classical schools. Well, in the first year of our first school opening, we had COVID hit in the middle of the year. So never a dull moment. So we went from in-person, no technology in the classroom, to having our parents in our car line, passing out laptops and what we called success kits, so that the parents had everything they need, the students had everything they need to be successful, and we wouldn't miss a beat academically because we couldn't afford to. We were a choice school. And if we weren't doing our jobs to teach those kids, they could just go somewhere else. So we had live learning every single day with our teachers and their students, which most people were not doing. They were just, passing out spreadsheets ditto sheets and things like that. We had live learning every day. We stuck to our classical curriculum, and we had parents contacting us who wanted their children to participate in our online program, whose children did not go to our schools. And some of them went to very expensive private schools that were not doing the same amount of work and effort in those COVID times as we were when things were shut down. When we came back in person, even, here in Florida, that was pretty soon. We had parents who said, we love the online program. We want to stay online, not because of health reasons, but just they love the fact that they could be involved in what their child was learning and see everything that was going on. And they had some flexibility to move and travel if they wanted to. So we decided to go ahead and create this online program, Optima Academy Online. I was also fortunate to be introduced to another innovator, Adam Mangana, became my business partner, who is doing live learning in virtual reality in the classical tradition as well during COVID. So he came, put me in a VR headset. I was underwater with a marine biology class, and their teacher was giving out information, and they were labeling parts of a whale as they was swimming by. We went to the moon. We learned about the lunar landing, and my mind was just blown. It was so much better than the checkerboard of faces that many of us, learned from and participate in every single day. And so Optima Academy Online was born and opened in 2022, where all of our live learning occurs in virtual reality at various locations, including Independence Hall, where we have our constitutional experience, and ancient Rome. And our kids really get to be immersed in their learning in that classical tradition. We have those rich classical literature that they're still reading, and the Constitution. They're still getting all the elements of a classical education, but instead of the checkerboard of faces, they get to participate with each other in VR. We have over 700 students now and continue to enroll like crazy. It's just growing. And we have 100 schools who are also using our curriculum in their classrooms. So they're getting that classical element and this innovative technology for immersive learning, and all of it really with the goal of improving academic outcomes, because this curriculum crisis is not going to solve itself. It's going to take innovators like myself, like Adam, and so many others. There are so many people out there who are trying to solve this, but we have to overcome the deficit of funding that we have versus the unions and the people who have been doing the same old thing forever and are not really producing results.
That sounds incredible. That's really neat, and it's so heartening to hear about that kind of innovation happening. Because I think a lot of the rich poor inequality issues that happen when people are adults stem from this inequality of education, and it really is. I think the teachers' unions bear a giant responsibility and for a lot of that inequality, and clearly somebody who is not getting that kind of support at home is at a disadvantage. It can't all happen in the schools. It has to happen within families and communities. But that's so exciting that you're using that kind of technology in such a positive way.
Well, and parents care about their kids getting a great education. I don't care if they're rich or poor, where they live, they want their children to do better than they have been able to do. And I mean, I love using Ben Carson as an example when people say, oh, parents, they don't know, they're not educated, so they can't select a school for their children. I mean, his mom was not literate and made sure that he read all of the great books. So don't tell me that they don't care enough to figure it out when they need to. I also use Miami-Dade as a great example when people say, well, if you give parents choice, they don't know what to choose. They won't be able to choose. You'll be leaving all these kids behind. In Miami-Dade County, over 75% of their students are not in their zone assigned school. Many of them are in magnet schools, there's charter schools, other choice options within the district. So it's not all outside of public school, but it is a good case study, because that means that when given the option, at least 75% of families are going to make an active choice for their child. And that's not to say the 25% that are in their zone school, some of them made that choice. So if at least 75% in the worst case, right, and probably more like 85% are actually making a choice about where to send their children to school, isn't that worth everyone having that option and creating an education marketplace and free market competition within that is going to help improve outcomes for students everywhere? So it's really about, and I've been advocating this, as Toni knows, for many years, education freedom, making sure that every single parent has the ability to vote with their feet when the student is not performing in that education environment, because whether they are rich or poor, whether they are middle class, whether the school they're assigned to is an A school, like it was for me and my children and just didn't work for my son, I still have to be able to make a choice outside of that A school, F school, or just an environment that is unsafe for my child. And that's going to give me that investment as a parent to say, I made this choice. I need to make sure that this is going to work well for my kid, because now it's on me, versus what we see when it's a government choice and the parents don't have an option and they go, well, if it's working or not, it's not my fault. It's the government's fault, because they're the ones who are forcing my children to go there. They're the ones who are in charge of my child's education. It's a complete culture shift that has to happen because parents really, ultimately, they want, and of course, they want it more than anybody else, what's best for their children.
I think what you just said about it ultimately boils down to the left's complete opposition to a free market solution for anything, healthcare, education, you name it.
Right.
It really does boil down to that. I hate to even ask the question, but what is your biggest fear if Kamala Harris is elected for the education system in America? What do you think worst case scenario is under a Harris-Walz administration?
Well, unfortunately, we have to start with the safety of women and girls. This Title IX issue that is just right in our faces right now, and the total elimination of the rights of women that many of my parents, grandparents have fought so hard to achieve, and they're trying to undo it. It's mind-blowing that this party that claims to be for women and for the underdog and for the rights of women would allow men to make us unsafe, both in sports, in our locker rooms, in private spaces. Unfortunately, it just starts with physical safety because the federal government has already intervened to overstep really states' rights in this area. Thankfully, states like Florida have stood up to them and said, we're not complying. But there are many states that have not done so and are really putting their women and girls at risk across the board. So I would start with just the physical safety of women and girls. That is a big concern to me, to Leadership Institute, to Heritage, and other organizations that I'm involved with. But secondly, the federal government remains with a lot of purse strings when it comes to education. And that's why I advocate for the elimination of the Department of Education and returning that to the states so that states can make their own decisions and be those pockets of innovation that our founding fathers intended when it comes to education policy. But right now, they can use those dollars to pull the strings and make the states, especially those that depend heavily on federal dollars, to do what they want or not do things that they don't want them to do, like expand school choice and try to dial those things back. Again, when it comes to a state like Florida, we have a very strong governor. We have a supermajority in the House and Senate who are supportive of these things. So I don't concern myself that it's going to get rolled back here. But in the states that it's tenuous and it's been a really difficult road to make these strides, and they're early on in their journey towards education freedom, it's going to be easier for the federal government to pull those strings and try to get them to undo things that we have worked so hard to get done.
Erika, one of the things when anybody on the right talks about the elimination of the Department of Education, the left makes it sound like, oh my gosh, they don't care about education at all. Look, they want to eliminate this thing, and they make it sound crazy. They make it sound extreme. But explain a little bit about what the Department of Education does now, and if you really did eliminate it, where would those dollars, how would those dollars be allocated, and what would be the real change that happens, and that it's not as if we are going to eliminate education in this country?
Right. Yeah. Most of education is controlled by the state level. So your Department of Education in your state is the one who is funding education primarily, setting the standards, setting the assessment standards. What the U.S. Department of Education has done in its very short history, by the way, has not presided over any increase in academic performance. I love to retort back with a question of, what has it done in its existence that would warrant keeping it over what the states have accomplished in that same amount of time and could accomplish with even more funding or more power? But the Federal Department of Education primarily is a student loan organization. So when people think of eliminating the Department of Education, they're thinking K-12 mostly, but they're forgetting that a lot of what they do is in regards to college student loans, which that doesn't mean that they're going to get completely out, although I wish they would, because it is what is behind the extreme inflation in college going costs. But for now, that would move into a different department of the federal government. Some have said Treasury, some have said others, but just why should the Department of Education be a student loan organization? That it's unnecessary for it to even exist for that purpose. Something like the Department of Education also handles discrimination claims in K-12 schools and things like that. So that would be something that also would go to the Department of Civil Rights and not be in a Department of Education any longer, but would still be handled at some federal level to protect people's constitutional rights or handle complaints and things like that. So it's not just eliminating everything that they do. Some of it's just being smarter about where those things belong. Why does there have to be a whole separate bureaucracy for a department that doesn't perform in its primary, what the expectation is of its primary function, which is to improve K-12 education? The one thing people also should acknowledge about the Department of Education is it has been the avenue for really failed policies of several presidencies to increase academic performance, whether it's No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top. It just hasn't worked, and it's not going to work. So all of these large federal programs that try to get more testing, more assessments, more accountability, states just find their way around that. And then districts find their way around what the state is doing. By the time you get to a district or to a classroom, what happens in Washington, D.C. has little to no effect. And yet there's so much money being spent in DC at the department that is never reaching the benefit of children. So block granting those funds, if we are going to continue to spend them at the federal level, down to the states, allowing the states to determine how those funds are used, or the districts or the schools, depending on how that state operates. That's going to be the best way to handle things going forward.
That is a great explanation for something that sounds very reasonable, that on the soundbite circuit makes it sound like you're going to blow up the local school.
Right.
Well, Erika, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. And thank you, the listener and the viewer, for taking the time to listen and watch. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network. New episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. Please subscribe at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back soon with another episode.